They built cities, but destroyed the soul. They prospered outwardly, but the land already reeked of judgment. Between the golden palm trees and the bustling markets, Sodom looked untouchable, but there was something human eyes couldn't see. The ground burned in silence, and the heavens could bear no more. How far can human freedom go before it wounds the heavens? What does God truly consider sin, and why? Sodom didn't fall overnight. What fell was the line between right and wrong. When everything became permissible, the voice of conscience turned into a faint whisper. Wealthy men, dazzling women, endless feasts. Everything seemed to shine. But behind the curtains, the cries of the oppressed, the forgotten, the cast aside, they rose. What makes a city worthy of judgment is not just the wrongdoing of a few. It's when sin becomes culture, celebration, pride. And that's what Sodom did. It institutionalized rebellion against heaven. It was no longer an occasional weakness, but a collective identity. And when sin becomes part of a people's soul, heaven responds. In those days, men looked at Sodom as a land of opportunity. The soil was rich, business was booming, gold flowed through their hands. But while human eyes saw prosperity, God's eyes saw smoke. Iniquity wasn't hidden. It was proudly displayed, like a trophy raised against eternal commandments. And in that brutal contrast lies the greatest mystery of this story. Why did God wait so long? Why didn't he destroy Sodom at the beginning, when the first cries reached him? And why did he choose Abraham, a man in tents, to be the first to know about the judgment to come? The answer lies in the heart of God. Before the fire, there was intercession. Before destruction, there was a warning. And this is where the journey begins, one that might change not only how you see Sodom, but how you understand judgment, mercy, and the true meaning of collective sin. This isn't just the story of a city that fell, it's a story about choices, about the silence that comes before judgment, and about the time God gives us before it's too late. When we look at Sodom, we see the reflection of many other cities, many other generations, even our own. Because sometimes what we think is far away is already living among us. And when the cry of a land becomes unbearable, heaven comes down, and it comes down with fire. In that sunset of orange hues, as the wind swept through the golden streets of Sodom, no one imagined the heavens had already delivered their verdict. The plazas were full, the parties being prepared, business thriving. But in the invisible realm, the sentence had already been declared, and it wasn't against a man or a single household, it was against an entire culture. Collective sin isn't born from one isolated act, but from the silent accumulation of many agreements with evil. It's when an entire city learns to ignore the sound of repentance, when evil ceases to be an accident and becomes a way of life. In Sodom, pride walked hand in hand with abundance. There was an excess of bread, but no compassion. There was leisure, but no empathy. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak remained silent. And God, who is justice, could no longer ignore the cries of those being crushed in the name of pleasure. Centuries later, the prophet Ezekiel would record, "Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. Pride, fullness of bread, and abundance of idleness was in her and in her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and needy." Ezekiel 16:49. It wasn't just about immoral acts, but hardened hearts, a system that no longer reflected the character of God. The city had become an expert in dehumanizing. There was no room for the foreigner, for the different, or for the righteous. Goodness was mocked, purity was scorned. The elderly, once revered for their wisdom, were now ignored. The youth, who should have been learning, were already masters of depravity. And the altars, they no longer existed. They had been replaced with celebrations of self. In one of the central squares, an old man rose with a trembling voice. He warned. He pleaded. He cried out, saying the city had turned its back on the Most High God, but his voice was drowned out by laughter. Coins were tossed at his feet, as if his words were part of the evening's entertainment. That night, no one listened, because Sodom had already chosen what it wanted to hear. And when sin stops being weakness and becomes culture, it changes form. It seeps into the walls, into the laws, into the customs. It cloaks itself in normalcy. What once brought shame is now paraded. It's no longer wrong. It's a right. It's at that precise moment that God rises, not because he hates, but because he loves too much to let the human soul destroy itself without restraint. Divine judgment isn't an outburst of rage. It's the final cry of a father who warned time and again and was ignored. If what happened in Sodom reminds you of the world around you, if you still believe the truth must be spoken, even when it makes people uncomfortable, then don't just listen, respond. Subscribe now and leave a like, because silence only strengthens the darkness. Share this message with someone who needs to wake up, and comment below, do you see signs of Sodom in our time? Because as long as there's someone willing to speak, there is still hope. Sodom wasn't an exception, it was a mirror. And that mirror still reflects in generations that trivialize what is sacred and turn grace into a license for anything. But while the city drowned in its pride, someone far away was on their knees, and that someone knew the heart of God. While Sodom drowned in its own arrogance, somewhere else, higher, simpler, quieter, a man lifted his eyes toward the heavens. Abraham. He didn't live in fortified cities or build marble columns. His tents were fragile, but his spirit was inhabited by a faith heavier than any throne. That afternoon, the Lord visited him. And as the heavenly footsteps turned towards Sodom, something burned within Abraham's heart. It was as if heaven itself had whispered, "Judgment is on the way." He knew, and so he did the unthinkable. He stood between heaven and earth, between justice and outcry, and he dared to intercede. "Wilt thou also destroy the righteous with the wicked?" he asked. His voice didn't tremble from fear but from compassion. He knew the character of God, but he also knew the streets of Sodom. He knew the spiritual corruption that had spread like poison, and yet he dared to ask. Abraham wasn't bargaining out of desperation. He pleaded with reverence. "If there are 50 righteous, will you still destroy the city?" And God, in a calm voice, replied, "If I find 50 righteous within Sodom, I will spare the whole place for their sake." Then came silence, a silence filled with courage. Abraham lowered his eyes, took a deep breath, and continued. 45, 40, 30, 20, 10. With each number, a hope. With each step, a revelation. Heaven listens. Heaven responds, but with every reduction came an unspoken warning. Perhaps not even 10 righteous would be found. Abraham's intercession didn't change Sodom, but it revealed something even more powerful, the heart of a God willing to spare the many for the sake of a few, and the heart of a man who dared to believe that faith could buy time, that prayer could delay judgment. That mercy could be extended because of one righteous soul. That conversation between Abraham and the Eternal wasn't just a theological exchange, it was a clash of souls, a moment when a finite man stood before the infinite, not to accuse but to plead, not to argue but to remind God of who he is. Merciful, compassionate, slow to anger. How many of us have dared to interrupt heaven's plans with tears? How many have stepped in between judgment and those we love? Interceding takes more than faith. It takes surrender. It takes love for those who may not even deserve it. Abraham could have stayed silent. He could have accepted the decree, but he chose to be a bridge. He chose to feel the pain of a city that perhaps no longer felt pain. And because of that choice, heaven paused for a moment and waited. Have you ever prayed for someone who doesn't pray for themselves? Have you ever stood in the gap for someone who seems too far gone to be reached? That's the kind of faith God listens to. And as Abraham came down from the mountain, his heart still in supplication, The angels were already approaching the gates of Sodom. The city, drunk on its self-sufficiency, had no idea that this night would be its final chance. The destruction of a city doesn't begin with earthquakes or fire from heaven. It begins with what no one sees, the slow deformation of the soul. In Sodom, the ruin wasn't in its walls, but in its hearts. There was gold in the plazas, but the spirit was already ashes. There was beauty in their garments, but the essence was irreversibly corrupted. Spiritual corruption is the most dangerous of all because it happens in silence. It doesn't invade like a storm. It seeps in like a mist that lulls the conscience to sleep. In Sodom, no one woke up one day and decided to destroy morality. It was a process, one compromise at a time, one value abandoned here, one truth ignored there, until, without realizing it, what was impure became normal. What was holy became a joke. The city didn't just tolerate evil, it promoted it, encouraged it, planned it. The lines that once separated light from darkness were erased with celebration. Sacred covenants were mocked. Kindness was reinterpreted as weakness, and justice seen as a threat. But the most tragic part was this: they believed they were evolving. They thought they were becoming freer, more modern, more open-minded. Pride was seen as self-confidence, lust as a form of freedom, godlessness as progress. The name of God was no longer feared, it was forgotten, or worse, replaced with other altars, invisible but real. Worship had shifted, now directed at the self, at personal will, at instant pleasure. It was in that context that the heavens declared enough, not because of one isolated sin, but because spiritual corruption had disfigured the image of God in man. What God had created in holiness, Sodom had redefined in its own image. It was a generation that no longer resembled the Creator, only its own cravings. In Lot's house, the few who still heard God's voice lived surrounded by an unrecognizable world. The righteous man who resisted was now viewed as a foreigner, a stranger, outdated. His faith was mocked, his sense of justice met with hostility, because when the entire world falls spiritually ill, those who still carry light begin to offend. On one of the city streets, a child watched a profane procession. Her eyes were empty, not of malice, but of absence. She no longer knew what was right or wrong. There were no more references. Growing up in Sodom meant growing up in a world without absolutes, without direction, without God. It's at this point that corruption ceases to be moral and becomes existential. The city had lost its soul, and the sound that rose from the earth to the heavens was not only made of cries of pain, but of absence, of voices that no longer prayed, of hearts that no longer believed, of families that had stopped teaching. Sodom became the biblical symbol of decline because it chose to erase God not just from its laws, but from its very identity. And when that happens, gold cannot sustain, walls cannot protect, time does not forgive. Yet while the nights were still filled with revelry and the halls echoed with deafening laughter, two silent shadows approached the city gates. They came not with swords, but with authority. They were visitors, angels, and their arrival would mark the final boundary between mercy and judgment. Night fell like so many others in Sodom. The streets lit up with torches and music. Wine flowed, and the halls overflowed with empty promises. It was yet another night of excess, another night in which heaven was ignored. But on this night, something different passed through the gates. Two men, simply dressed, walked through the stone alleys. Their steps were steady, yet discreet. Eyes passed over them unaware. They were travelers, yes, but not of the ordinary kind. These men came from above. They were angels, sent not to warn, but to witness. Sodom's time had run out. Lot saw them first. He was sitting at the city gate, watching the night unfold. He still held onto the habit of seeking justice in a place that no longer knew it. When he saw the strangers, he felt something. Perhaps fear, perhaps reverence. He ran to them, bowed low, urgently insisted they come to his home. He knew all too well what might happen if they spent the night in Sodom's streets. They accepted his invitation, and as darkness fell, the city once again revealed what it had become. In the dead of night, the men of the city, all ages, surrounded Lot's house. They banged on the door, they shouted, they demanded the visitors. They didn't seek to know them, but to dominate, not to welcome, but to violate. The city didn't just sin, it rebelled against heaven. It wasn't enough to be corrupt, it had to drag everything down with it. Lot stepped outside. He shut the door behind him. He tried to speak. He pleaded, his words full of desperation. But his voice was drowned out by the roar of the crowd. They shouted back, "This foreigner wants to be a judge?" The city would no longer tolerate any voice that challenged its decay. Justice was now offensive, holiness an insult. But the line was crossed when they tried to break in. That's when the visitors revealed who they were. The angels pulled Lot back inside, slammed the door shut, and with a single gesture, struck the men with blindness. Suddenly, those who threatened couldn't see. But even blind, they clawed at the doorway in fury, still trying to force their way in. This wasn't just physical blindness, it was spiritual. Even without sight, they insisted on breaching the final barrier between heaven and the abyss. In that moment, Sodom lost its last thread of conscience. When not even divine intervention can restrain the hunger for evil, the time of grace dissolves, and judgment begins to descend. Then the angel said, "Do you have anyone else here, sons-in-law, sons, daughters, anyone else in the city who belongs to you? Get them out of here, for we are going to destroy this place." There was no more time for discussion. It was time to leave, time to choose. Lot ran to his sons-in-law, spoke of the coming destruction, begged them. But they laughed, thought he was joking. Sodom's disbelief had seeped into its homes. Destruction had already begun in the hearts of those who no longer believed in warnings. Outside, chaos. Inside, the final warning. The sound of the crowd was no longer human. It was beastly. A city driven mad by the absence of God. As Lot hesitated, the angels grabbed his hand. It was time to flee, without looking back. Morning would come soon, but not with light, with judgment. And the door that separated the house from the street was now more than just wood. It was the line between mercy and the end. The sun had not yet risen, but something was already burning on the horizon, and it wasn't light. Lot hesitated. His eyes lingered on what he would leave behind, his feet still rooted in the soil of the city. But the angels did not hesitate. They took him by the hand, him, his wife, and his 2 daughters. They pulled them out forcefully. That escape was no longer a choice. It was deliverance. There was no time for luggage, for goodbyes, or spiritual farewells. The deadline had passed. The final prayer had been prayed. The last chance had been given. Now heaven moved in justice. Flee for your life. Do not look back, and do not stop anywhere in the plain. Escape to the mountains, or you will be swept away, said the messengers. And then, with the urgent pace of one running from destruction, Lot fled. Behind him, the city still slept. Bodies tossed in beds, emptied of purpose. Closed halls held the remnants of godless nights, and the altars of self were still standing. But judgment didn't come with trumpets. It came with silence, followed by fire. It happened at dawn. From the heavens fell brimstone and fire. This wasn't a natural event. It was supernatural, a judgment that came from above, from a God who had endured long, and now acted. The earth shook. Hills were swept away. Fields were scorched. Streets turned to ash. There was nowhere to hide. Because this judgment wasn't only geographical, it was moral, spiritual, existential. God wasn't merely erasing a city, he was answering a cry. And every stone that fell echoed the voices of the oppressed. Every flame bore witness to prayers ignored by men, but heard by God. Sodom, so proud of its independence, was destroyed without being able to respond. Its kings, its nobles, its wise men, all turned to dust in an instant. There were no exceptions, no hiding places. Because when God's judgment comes, it is absolute, but it is always just. It never arrives suddenly. It comes after many chances, many warnings, many intercessions. Divine judgment is never the first response, it's the last. And even in that final act, there was still mercy. Because a family escaped, because someone once interceded, because God, even in fire, still protects those who trust in him. Lot didn't run because he was perfect. He ran because he was reached by grace. And that is what sustains the righteous in days of judgment, not the strength of their merits, but the undeserved favor of the God who sees, hears, and acts at the exact time. And as the heavens closed in smoke over the ashes of a city that forgot God, one silent question hovered over the mountains. Who are we when the fire falls? And there's no time left to turn back. Lot and his daughters were still running, their steps hurried, while behind them the sky split open with smoke and flame. The earth trembled beneath their feet. Judgment reigned upon Sodom, but in the midst of the escape there came a sharp silence, a pause, and then a look. Lot's wife stopped. She said nothing. She simply turned her head. She looked back. It lasted only a second, just a gesture. But it wasn't about the eyes, it was about the heart. She didn't just look, she longed to return. She still belonged to what God had already rejected. Her legs ran toward the mountain, but her soul still lived in Sodom, and in that instant she was transformed, not into a body consumed by fire, but into a pillar of salt, an eternal symbol of someone called to escape, but unable to let go. The lesson is piercing. Some destructions don't happen outside, they begin within. What kills first is not the fire, it's the attachment. And many remain spiritually frozen, paralyzed between the past and their purpose, because they still look back with longing at what heaven has already commanded them to leave behind. She walked alongside the righteous, but her heart was still among those who were falling. How many today live that same conflict? How many walk forward but never fully surrender? How many flee from judgment while still carrying the desire to return to the ashes? The past that God burns must never be gazed upon with nostalgia. Sodom was reduced to ashes. Its gates no longer exist. Its columns lie buried beneath layers of silence. Not one stone was left standing. But the question that echoes through the centuries is, did Sodom truly disappear? The answer is unsettling. Because Sodom today is no longer found on maps, but lives on in values, choices, and cultures. It revives every time truth is rejected, every time pride replaces humility, every time compassion dies in the alleys of indifference. The spirit of Sodom is subtle. It doesn't arrive shouting. It settles in as progress, disguises itself as freedom, and once it takes shape, it no longer recognizes what is sacred. That's why this story is not just archaeology, it's a mirror. God didn't destroy Sodom out of pleasure. He destroyed it because no one was listening anymore, because collective sin left no room for repentance, because the righteous had become an intruder, a stranger, a nuisance. But today, if there is still someone who listens, who intercedes, who cries out, then hope still breathes. If this story spoke to you, if any part stirred your faith, don't keep it to yourself. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share this message with someone who needs to wake up, and write in the comments, what part of this story challenged your heart the most? As long as there's someone who listens, Sodom does not win.